What's going on YouTube? We're back at it for another video, and today we've got the top 5 orbital stratagems that you can use inside of Helldivers 2. Now, they may not be the shining bit of excellence that all of the other stratagems can be, but there are more than a few of these orbital stratagems that can be quite useful in some of your loadouts, and some of them that can be completely game-changing in some of the matches you may have. Now, that being said, we've got a lot of things to cover, so let's jump straight into it. Coming up at number 5, we've got the Orbital Precision Strike, which is going to be a bit troublesome to use, but once you do line up the shot with this one, it can deal some hefty damage to whatever target you may land on. The big issue with it is the fact of the call-in time. And now it says 3 seconds when it comes to the stratagem on the ship management, but it will be a total of 5 seconds before it lands at whatever location your stratagem marker is. Now, I will say it is 100% accurate, so wherever this has landed, it will hit that exact spot, and it is going to be pretty precise, which is nice, but in that moment when it comes to moving targets, it can be troublesome to line that up with the 5 seconds you have to wait before it actually ends up landing. Something that could benefit this is something like Orbital EMS Strike or the EMS Mortar. You can utilize it in those instances, and with Orbital EMS it is a 75-second cooldown, so just under what the 100-second cooldown is for Orbital Precision Strike. Using these in a combination might be a good combination to throw into some of those loadouts you use in the future. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say this is the best combination, but it is something that can make it or make the most out of the Orbital Precision Strike. Now, sadly enough, when it comes down to call-in time modifiers for harder difficulties, when it increases by 100%, I'd almost say this is not something you'd want to use. Having 10 seconds before this lands in is almost way too long to wait on just one singular blast, but it does have its utility factor of being able to close up some of those bug holes and destroy those automaton fabricators, along with the mortar emplacements or the anti-aircraft on the automaton side of things. And it will also have the capability of devastating those tanks out there. You will be able to deal quite a bit of damage to Bile Titans. They're going to be one of the easier targets, along with the tanks on the automaton side of things, as you have a bit of an easier time kiting these type of enemies. Now, not necessarily are you going to one-shot a Bile Titan. It's possible if it did pop it straight in the face, but I have not had this moment or this instant happen. But I do know that it does quite a bit of damage to Bile Titans, and if you've already done some damage to it, say you've already struck it with a rail cannon or a rocket pod, or just been beating it railgun shots, more than likely this is going to be something that can finish it off and finish off any enemies that may be around it or underneath it effectively. And on top of that, it will one-shot chargers, it will take down those hulks. You just have to find the time to line the shot up for it to actually be useful, and that's why we've put it all the way down at the number 5 slot. It has uses, but it is a bit troublesome to work around. Coming up at the number 4 slot, we've got Orbital Airburst Strike, which I was a little bit surprised by. It's a bit useful when it comes to the crowd control, but even on the automaton side of things, it can deal some pretty decent damage towards medium-type bots, or medium-type enemies on the bot side of things. It is one of those that has an explosive nature to it, and I wonder whether or not, like, the shrapnel it produces, considering the description it gives is a projectile which explodes while airborne and then releasing shrapnel downward. I believe the shrapnel itself also has an explosive attribute to it, so when it does hit weak spots, it does have that amplified amount of damage, and I believe that's why it ends up being so destructive towards those medium bots on the automaton side of things. But at that same time, it does have the capability of striking 3 times, so that may also be an attributed factor to it that gives it such a stopping power, which is excellent for the bug side of things for that crowd control, as there's plenty of times where you're basically just booking it. You've got a line of those bugs behind you. Something like the cluster bomb will come and do a straight line, basically diagonal with what's facing in front of you, and it'll just be done right there, whereas something like the Airburst Strike is pretty fantastic for these type of situations, to strike once, get that first group of that tailing bug horde you have behind you, but then strike again and then strike a third time, kind of churning through that massive crowd that you have behind you. And it would be something that would be excellent for some of those retreats or just moving out of certain areas, being able to throw this just behind you and capably destroy the things that would be following you and have it consistently deal damage as you're moving forward. So it's not just taking out a small portion of the front of that crowd or even the middle, depending on when you threw it. it can be able to take out more than a hefty chunk of that crowd effectively. Coming up at number 3, we've got the Orbital Walking Barrage, which I'm not a huge fan of the barrages in this game, as their RNG factor can be extremely devastating to not only the enemies, but sometimes not the enemies, and sometimes only your teammates. It can be quite frustrating. But with the Orbital Walking Barrage, we get a bit better grouping with this, we get a bit more organization, the RNG factor is a little bit lessened when it comes to the overall team-friendly fire, and benefits more at destroying the enemies in front of you. More specifically, pushing into some of your enemies, or even as you're going away from enemies, and being able to clean up some of those that are tagging behind you as you're moving from objective to objective. There's nothing worse than having a large group that ends up chasing you all the way over to where your next objective is, and throwing something like this behind you that will effectively push forward with massive explosions and be able to clear up some of that crowd. Hopefully, it's not always as consistent as I'd like it to be, but in the instances where it does hit those targets, it does have quite the damaging effect to them. And it will be clearing out some of those crowds. And you can utilize this even at the last moment when it comes to extraction. If you've got quite a few enemies coming from one general direction, throwing this one out and having it be able to push in a zigzag with those explosions can clear up quite a bit of those enemies and be pretty beneficial for those last moments, especially in Helldive difficulty when it gets to be almost overwhelming at times, to the point where every single time you're jumping onto that ship, you've got a massive crowd of enemies just basically nipping at the heels of you. It's quite the experience, and it's definitely one that's still enjoyable, but it can be moments from death every single time, if not completely getting overwhelmed and eviscerated. But do be careful with using the Walking Barrage, as I would highly suggest every time you throw this in front of you, it may land right next to the marker with the first explosions, but there have been more than a few times where I'd say back up a good ways from that marker that you juiced through, as sometimes it will start pretty far behind that marker essentially, and let your teammates know when you do throw this down, as it is going to be quite big explosions, and if they have no idea and they start pushing into those front lines or pushing back to where you may have thrown this, it doesn't take much, or it doesn't take too far a distance from one of these explosions to be absolutely devastated. Coming up at our number 2 slot, we've got the Orbital Rail Cannon Strike, which is not one that I generally find to be my personal favorite, and not one that I generally use all that often, but it cannot be looked over with how quick, how easy, and how fast it can take out some of these enemies, and how devastating it can be. When it comes to chargers, hulks, tanks, those frustrating cannon turrets over there on the automaton side of things, and being able to take out some of those automaton fabricators, on top of that being able to dish out devastating damage towards a Bile Titan. Sadly enough, in Helldive difficulty, it can one-shot, but it depends on the angle of the rail cannon and where it strikes. If it hits the body, you will need to finish off the Bile Titan with some additional damage. But if it does get that angle just right, where it's hitting the neck or just the head directly, you will still get that one shot, but it does rely a little bit on RNG in that moment. But there's nothing wrong with having one of those easy button stratagems that you just throw out near whatever large target you have, and then being able to just strike them down right where they stand. It's pretty fantastic in certain instances, but for me personally, it's one of those moments that I have so many other stratagems that I can deal with some of these large targets with, that I don't necessarily need this all that often. And I would say, if you've got a group of 4 with you and one person already has a rail cannon strike, let that one person be the only one with it, as it is still one of those almost 3-minute cooldowns, if not longer, without the ship upgrades that further decrease the overall cooldown time. And it almost ends up at a 4-minute mark when it comes down to its overall cooldown. And when you compare this to something like the rocket pods of the Eagle Stratagem, you could almost get the same effect out of the Eagle Stratagem as the rail cannon strike, but giving more capable chances of being able to strike with it, and having a lower cooldown to have 3 chances to have that same capable amount of damage. But it does deserve its spot at the rank 2 slot when it comes to the Orbital Stratagems, as it is quick, easy, and devastating. Coming up at our number 1 slot is going to be the Orbital Laser, the absolute melter, the S tier when it comes to overall stratagems. I mean, out of all the Orbital Stratagems, this is absolutely the number 1. It is devastating to just about everything. Anything in its path will start to get melted. This can even take down Bile Titans by itself. Now, I will highly suggest dealing damage to that Bile Titan so it's not all wasted on top of that Bile Titan, but it can be life-saving in those instances when that's all you have left after you've already cleared the crowds, you've got other things on cooldowns, and possibly you have multiple Bile Titans. So in that instance, this can be one that targets one of them while you deal with the other with other stratagems. But the big reason for how devastating this is it's an absolute game changer in certain instances. Say, well, things have hit the fan and you and the team are in a bit of a pickle. You've got too many bot drops, you've got too many bug breaches going on. Throw one of these in and it is going to be an absolute crowd control machine. It is going to be burning through small, medium, and all the way up to large enemies, taking down those chargers, doing a bit of a slowed effect on any enemy that it is hitting as well, on top of dealing that damage over time of fire along with its own damage penetrating them. It's a bit absurd, and throwing this into an automaton base or even into a bug nest to clear things out before even walking in, I mean, it takes just about no time. It'll even take out the auto cannon turrets or the cannon turrets over there on the automaton side of things. It'll even take out automatons, fabricators. You can really easily clear through blitz missions with this thing if everybody on the team has one. And it does have a pretty hefty cooldown to it of 5 minutes, but if you've got one, if not two people on your team with this, it can be absolutely life-saving. One of the only drawbacks is the simple fact that this literally only has 3 uses per match. I would love to use this more often, and a lot of loadouts would benefit from using this. Just having 2 people on your team with both of them having this orbital laser in their loadout is going to be a game changer when coming into Helldive difficulty, and it can clear boards really quickly. It's an absolute melter, and you just can't go wrong with throwing this into any loadout you have. Arguably, this would be one of those stratagems that I'd say can work in just about any loadout, as long as you know how to use it. Do be mindful with this thing. You know, don't throw it close to teammates, as yeah, that is definitely an orbital laser right there. That thing is going to vaporize them instantly if it runs across them, and it will run across you as well. So keep in mind how many enemies are around you and try to keep your distance. Throwing this at a distance so that you have time to move away from enemies while this thing comes arcing over towards you or in your general direction can be a good idea to start with. And do be mindful, this will leave a trail of fire behind it, so don't try to follow this laser as it's moving around, as that will start damaging you as well. That being said, the orbital laser is pretty much a must-have stratagem. And when it comes to honorable mentions, we have something like the Orbital EMS Strike, which is something that can work in combination with other stratagems and be beneficial in that manner, where you can stop those enemies and give yourself a moment to be able to line up the shot with something like the Eagle's Airstrike or 500 kg when it comes to a Bile Titan. Things like that can be pretty beneficial when you've got those working together, but it can be inconsistent at times, considering if it doesn't land directly on top of that enemy, it will not stop it in place. It has to be struck with it. It doesn't seem that when enemies start walking into it, they start actually getting affected by it, but those that are struck by it will be pretty much immediately neutralized for a brief, almost 10 seconds, and then they'll start to continue right after that. But in moments like that, it can be beneficial if you have something like the modifier call-in time increased by 100%. This can be something to alleviate some of those long times to call in when it comes to the Eagle Strikes or the Orbitals that you would like to deal a ton of damage to some of these high-value targets or larger enemies that you may be dealing. Coming up right after that is the Orbital Gas Strike. I wouldn't necessarily say this thing is amazing, but it can deal some damage. I've tried using it in combination with the Orbital EMS, but I almost feel as though it's one of those moments where you'd need the Orbital EMS, the Orbital Gas Strike, and then Napalm to get enough of the effect to truly damage and kill all of the enemies. But at that point, it's like you've wasted 3 different cooldowns on a moment that just could have been basically vaporized with one airstrike or one cluster strike. It does some damage, but not enough to just write home about. Even in lower difficulties, it isn't the most amazing thing, and generally the smaller enemies may be the ones that get the brute force of the actual damage, and this is something that may be more beneficial when facing off against the Terminid rather than the actual automatons. Even though it will do damage to the medium bots, it will showcase basically them smarking. They've definitely taken a good bit of damage, but it's just not enough to be something that I would take out another stratagem, or it's not enough for me to slot this into my loadouts in the future. The last honorable mention is going to be the Orbital Gatling Barrage. This one is not the worst. It definitely does have explosive damage, and I would say it is a bit more beneficial when it comes to the Terminid side of things, but you can deal damage when it comes to the automatons. But with its RNG, with its smaller radius, and it's just not going to be as damaging unless it does do direct hit damage to some of the automatons. It can be a bit lackluster. It can be decent at crowd control, but I find that the Orbital Airburst ends up doing more than what the Orbital Gatling Barrage can deal, and that's why it is just one of those things that may be up to your personal preference as to whether or not you'd want to use this over the Airburst, as it does have a shorter cooldown time. When it comes to orbitals that I just flat out generally wouldn't use, that's going to be the orbital barrages of the 120mm and the 380mm. These have so much RNG to them, and they can almost be counterintuitive. Generally, I do not find that these even hit the target, it is so rare that I find that these actually do what I would like them to do. It could be cool, it can be fun to throw this in, but it is definitely one of those that I end up killing my teammates or killing myself a lot more with something like this. And in general, even if I do throw this into a base or even close to some of the bug nests, or in moments where we're running away and I throw this behind me, it just doesn't seem to hit all that often. It seems that I'm just looking at explosions that end up dancing around the enemies rather than hitting the enemies, or going off way further from the stratagems marker location than I would ever think to be possible. And at some future point, hopefully that they can implement some type of system that gets us to have the capability of tightening up the grouping on this. I believe somebody in the comments said it was open and closed sheaf, and I would like to see this implemented in the future. Appreciate everybody in the comments letting me know about some of these terms that I'd never heard of before. But overall, I would highly consider just avoiding these up until the point where you could find yourself in a better position to utilize this. I feel there are so many different stratagems that just outweigh the impact of what this can deal. The amount of RNG that is implemented with each one of these is just making it almost a waste every time you use it, and there is quite a long cooldown with this one. It's going to be 4 minutes every single time, and there's nothing worse than waiting 4 minutes to maybe kill a few enemies, or just deplete some of your reinforcements. It's just one that I feel is counterintuitive at this point. But if you are going to use one of these barrages, I would highly suggest the 120mm, as it is the one that has a more concentrated effect, and it is in a tighter grouping than the 380. The 380 is one that, whew, man, I'm telling you, you don't want to be anywhere close to this one. It's going to be blowing somebody to bits, that's for sure. If anybody's within a 50-meter radius of that stratagem marker, it is devastating. And, well, I mean, I guess you could run through it and be a madman, be an interesting story to tell your friends, but more than likely I could see you just getting blown to bits, and I can see another drop pod coming down. The last one I would say that is one that I would probably avoid using is going to be the Orbital Smoke Strike. The reason I say this is that the Smoke Strike for the Eagle is just much more, or it's effectively the same thing, but you get 3 uses out of it, and it's only a 2-minute cooldown once you've depleted them. So having the capability of each 8 seconds having another one of these smoke strikes, instead of just having to wait almost 2 minutes to have one smoke strike at a time, is going to be much more beneficial for your team if you are going with the route of utilizing smoke for cover against the automatons. But that's going to be it right there, guys. That's going to be the top 5 for the orbital stratagems. The orbital stratagems may not be the best in slot in my opinion, but there are a few of them that are going to be pretty beneficial for some of those loadouts out there and some of those team compositions. There's more than a few tricks that you can implement from some of them as well that may not be on that top 5. That orbital EMS isn't exactly something I would completely look over. You may want to tinker around with it. I will be playing around with it when it comes to future loadouts that I'll be making myself. I had a good bit of fun with testing with it and trying to work it in combination with some of the other stratagems. So we'll see what kind of implementations I can actually work up with some of this. And we'll have some of that content coming up this weekend. So if you'd like to see more of this content, hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to see some of this content live, hit that link down in the description below. Follow me over at Twitch. We are streaming daily, and we've got plenty more to come when it comes to Helldivers 2. Arguably, I think at this point, I'm just waiting on Dragon's Dogma 2 over at the end of March, along with the Alone in the Dark game and I believe the South Park Snow Day game. That's going to be a good time, no doubt. But we've got a long month ahead of us, and more than likely, the next Thursday is coming up for this next month. We're almost there, and there should be another War Bonds Pass thing that's coming out with that. More than likely, a few new weapons, and hopefully the number one thing on the sites or in my sights for the horizon is when we finally get that mech that has the missiles and the minigun on it that we can get inside of from the first game. Oh, buddy, I can't wait for that. That's going to be a beautiful day. You better believe that's going to be a good video that day. But on that note, hopefully you've enjoyed, and have a good one.